I'd like to just start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and say thank you, Tim, for inviting me today, and thanks everybody for participating. I thought yesterday was some really interesting discussions, and I hope in the next little while I can contribute to that by opening up some issues, but I think it's also a chance for us to reflect on some of the bigger themes, which the question around should we mandate teaching qualifications for academic staff, and I'll see, it's even working there, allows us into. I mean, I was delighted when Tim suggested I might want to say something about this, partly because it's a very live issue, as many people will know, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But as I say, it's rough times in some ways for the sector, as we've acknowledged in different ways, and there's a lot of possibility. But we are, I think, at one of those moments where, as a sector in Australia, but indeed internationally, we have the opportunity to make some decisions that will last with providers, will affect students for many decades to come. We don't always have these moments. I mean, I know it's always a time of change, but if you do look back at the history of how higher education has developed in Australia, and I've written quite a bit about this and been lucky enough to do quite a few projects, you do tend to get moments where when some things are bedded down, we become quite path dependent. And I think certainly in terms of the question of how we are structuring academic careers, which I'll talk a bit about, now is one of those moments where we do have a real opportunity, and that's both for universities but for all higher education providers. Now, before I begin, I should say that I will be largely talking about universities today, but that's partly shorthand and to get us into thinking about some of the broader issues. So with that said, I might kick it off. So, should teaching credentials be required for academic staff? Now, as I said, many of you will be aware that this is a fairly live issue. ATEC has been discussing this, the Minister has talked about it, and it is an interesting question when we think about the fact that it may be required soon. Okay? Now, how it's required, we'll talk a little bit about later, but I think to open this up, we should really acknowledge that part of the discussion around why we might have requirements for teaching credentials comes about an anxiety over the quality of education. And I think we need to be quite upfront about that at the beginning. I will unpick this in different ways, and I don't want to spend the next little while prosecuting a whole lot of debates around why teaching qualifications will improve the quality of education, because I think that's been done in different contexts and we really would be here all day. But nonetheless, I think we need to acknowledge that that's the starting point for thinking about why a government, why there might be a move on to require teaching qualifications for academic staff in universities. And as I'll also unpick as we go through this, it does have some pretty significant, or could have some pretty significant implications for how we run these institutions, for what academics do on a day-to-day basis, for what we require of them, for how we think about the full range of academic careers. It allows us to unpick a whole lot of things that I think, as I said before, are some pretty fundamental questions we have an opportunity really to deal with at the moment. So, I'll go on to say that, I mean, it's really hard to argue that having people that are qualified to teach is a bad thing, okay? On the face of it, and this is why it does become an interesting conversation in higher education, if you look at other education sectors, of course we expect those that are teaching in our primary and secondary, and now in particular in our early childhood sector, to be qualified. It's not even something that people would question. Yet in higher education, for a whole series of reasons we'll start to unpack, that hasn't been the case. But, and this is where it starts to get really quite complicated, the who and how and when, all right, is not as straightforward as it's sometimes presented. And that's going to be critical to this story as we think about if really we are worried about teaching quality, if we're worried about the quality of the experience of students, thinking about solving that as the problem becomes much more complex than just mandating some sort of qualification for teaching staff, and really allows us to unpick what are the bits that we want to invest in, what are the bits we don't think need to be invested in, what are the things that we think we can mandate and require, because often this is down to that, and what are those things that we want to encourage. Right? It really, and I'll sort of start to end here when I work through some of the material, it does force us to ask whether teaching credentials can actually help guarantee teaching quality, as I say. And it also raises a whole lot of practical questions if we're thinking about mandating teaching credentials around a lot of the discussion we had yesterday. Liz Barre and others, and Liz and I have done some work on this, looking at industrial arrangements, what are requirements, who and what is required for different EAs, and also the kind of broader implications for the workforce when we think about different workforce categories and who could be required. That itself can create quite a pathway to change that may inhibit, but also there's an opportunity to enable us there. So with that said, I'm going to leap into the material, and I'd like to start by asking who is doing the teaching. How has this changed in recent years? Because I think this is a way in before I return to starting to think about some substantive questions of credentialing and academic professions, and indeed where I think some of this is going. Just want to talk a little bit about how things have changed in the last 40 years. So I know it's hard to see there, and we will have an opportunity to share some slides, but I have put up the entire university workforce from 1985. Actually, it's on 3 slides, but I was going to bring in the original books. They're great little, things to hold up. In some ways, this is quaint, and why have I started here? Because in the last 4 decades plus, year or two, some things have really changed and some things have not. Now, as I say, this is literally from the uni stats. It has all the, every workforce category and activity is listed here. We have every staff member listed here that was working in the universities at the time. Now there's a couple of things, and the reason I put this up is not because it's quaint, not because it's a good visual, because it does tell us a little bit about some things that have changed. So just a couple of things I'll point out before I talk about some of the trends and show you some other data. Okay, it is divided into appointment activity classifications. And what that means is that we, for academic staff, it's interesting. We have teaching and research, and we have research only. We're missing a very important category that we'll talk about in a moment, and those that are teaching-focused staff. Now, those that were teaching and research, there's no division on the balance of that, and we talked yesterday briefly, I think, about the 40-40-20 model. That is not something that made as much sense when you go back further and further, decades. And especially if you go back 100 years, where if you looked at the teaching load of a professor, it was probably 35 hours a week, I think. Whole lot of activities in there, but that is a very different model and way to think about it. So this is by way of giving a caution to say that things have always been done a particular way, because things do change, and they change relatively quickly over the decades. Second thing I just want to point out before we move on is that there is a whole lot of classifications in here for activities like scientific services and language laboratories. These are effectively teaching staff when you look into what they did, right? Now, in the current classifications, we tend to put these all under certain categories. Like a lot of these were level A's, some of them weren't. We'll talk about what that means at a moment. And just finally, we have categories there of tutor and demonstrator and senior tutor and demonstrator, right? So we really called out those junior levels. So what has changed in the last 4 decades? Quite a bit, obviously, but there's a couple of things I just want to point out there. So we've had more teaching-focused roles. We've had much more teachings done by junior academics, and I'll show you some data on this in a second. And we have many people on casual contracts and short-term contracts, and that is something that has changed quite significantly since the 70s and 80s when you look at who's the balance of who's doing what in the universities. So as I said, I'm going to put some data up here. Don't worry too much. A lot of this data we'll be able to share, but I'll talk you through it. So I've just got up here the estimated proportion of academic teaching focused full-time equivalent in the sector, including casuals. And as you can see, since 1991, it was fairly high for those that were in effectively teaching focused roles. And as I said, it wasn't classified like that in 1985, but when you look into what people were doing, but it has really increased. So we do have now probably 30% of the workforce in recent years who are effectively on an FTE basis in a teaching focused role. Importantly in that, the proportion of casuals starting at about 15%, this is of academics, teaching staff, starting at about 50% in 1990. Obviously everybody is aware in this room that it increased significantly over the years. After COVID and the process of decasualisation in a number of institutions, it's reduced, but it is still very high, right? And I think that's something that we just need to be conscious of, that a lot of the teaching is done by junior staff. So here I've put level A, and a lot of those are casual. Importantly, and this is the other bit that I just want to call out here, when we look at the activities that the junior staff are undertaking, and they have increased, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, what we've done is we have put a lot of, we've kept the proportion of those that are casual. This is junior, so level A, tutors and above. A lot of these people are giving lectures as well. But we've also put a number of those on limited term contracts, very small number on ongoing. So we have, certainly in the last 4 decades, built a teaching workforce that is increasingly people that are on teaching focused roles, and often they're quite junior. So we might say that we obviously value teaching in higher education, but it does start to, and this will be critical, I'll come to this again later, but we don't always value teaching in higher education, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, we're thinking about requirements for things like teaching credentials. It goes to careers and how we reward people in careers and how we structure careers. And so just to kick us off today, I just wanted to have us pause and start to think about this question of who's doing the teaching and how are we rewarding it. One way into it is to look at the number of teaching focused staff by level in the universities. This is hard to read, but broadly what it shows, that big black band down the bottom are those level A's we just talked about, who are teaching focused staff. What you will see in the, and this is a welcome change, but very slowly we've got some more senior staff who are teaching focused. But really, the number of, that little red line you can see there, that's the number of C's, and D's and E's are above that. I mean, they're vanishingly small when you compare it to T&R staff, where T&R staff for C and D is like 30, C, D and E is like 30% or something like that. Oh, there we're going here. So, that's just given you, before I start to get into and talk about professional requirements, the teaching workforce in the last, as I say, in the last 4 decades has changed in many ways. We have a lot more junior staff, right? And this, we'll just pause here for a second, this has some implications, as I say, for both thinking about academic careers, but also, importantly, it starts to raise questions about how we're structuring work requirements. And as I will turn to now, the question of whether or not teaching qualifications, whether it is people that are focused on teaching, whether it is people that are teaching and research staff, should be part of professional requirements for academia. Because this is another way into thinking about that question of credentialing, is if we just pause and think about academia as a profession. Now, the term profession gets used in a whole series of ways, but here I am thinking about it as we regulate and structure most professions, be they medicine, be they teaching, be they a whole range of professions. And we might think about some of those key features. So, professions. What do professions do? You'll forgive me, I'm just going to run through and talk a little bit about some of the structures of professions. Now, broadly, we think about professions as an important guardian of a social institution. This is the sort of high-minded stuff there. But more practically, when we talk about professions, we expect them to have a advisory role and often a fiduciary role, right? So we have legal and other requirements that sit around professions. They are recognised as somebody that should be rewarded for their particular knowledge, but also in that they are regulated. Now, the reason I raise this is because if we start to think about how we structure academic work and academic careers, some of this doesn't always match up. So, I just want to quickly talk about some common characteristics. So, for most professions, as we regulate them broadly, and we've just done some work for UNESCO actually looking at the academic profession more broadly, and it is interesting how it does stand out internationally when you start to look at some of these features. So, rules for entry. Need to have an accepted practice. This is for most professions. Agreed ethical framework, often linked to the licensing regime. Required qualification, recognised by a professional body or regulator. Okay? And require or have a strong expectation of continuing professional development. Now, when we look at academia, this is where I think it starts to get helpful to think about academia as a profession and question of requirements. So, do we have an agreed ethical framework? Now, broadly, if you look around, the question of peer review and academic freedom, right, as core tenets of what academics do, is probably as close to the kind of ethical frameworks you find internationally. Yes, we have other work requirements. We have other requirements as virtue of being employed, as part of your contract. But if we think about it as a profession, as a privileged group of people, this is probably as close. More importantly is the question of required qualifications. Now, if you go back 100 years, there was obviously no particular qualification required to enter the profession. People assume now that most academics have a PhD. It is almost universally a requirement if you look at most position descriptions to have doctoral to have a doctoral qualification to be able to get through the door. It is not necessarily universal. As many of you know, in the institutions, we still have large numbers in some areas that do not have PhDs, but it's probably as close to a universal requirement in most countries to have doctoral credential. But of course, for those, many of us in the room have done PhDs, that is effectively a research focused degree, right, which does start to go back. If we go back to that question of how we've been valuing teaching and why we might want to credential it and how that's going to practically work, having a PhD is not the thing that is necessarily going to solve it. Entry rules, and this is where once again it gets interesting. When we think about entry rules into the profession, we do not have a licensing regime. It's obvious. I know this is obvious, but when you start to unpick it, it starts to get, it's a useful way to think about some of these questions. We obviously don't have a licensing regime. It is up to individual institutions and employers. It's up to internal academic governance usually, really is the one that's supposed to be the guardians of who we've got in and who we've allowed in. But of course, internationally this presents, it's quite a challenging situation when we start to think about how we're ensuring that our staff are qualified to do what we want them to do. The other reason I raise this is if we think about a lot of the anxiety that governments and regulators in particular, right, this is where we start to get into it, have, and which regulators might I be talking about here? If you think about the challenge that TEXA has in questions of assuring quality, what they're not doing yet is putting really strict rules around things like qualifications, right? That's not in the standards, as you know. There's been some discussion about putting it in there, but you can start to see instantly the challenge that might present if you've got a workforce of 60, 70, 80,000 head count, if you count a lot of the casuals academic staff, what that would look like to try and ensure that all of those had appropriate teaching qualifications. And continuing professional development. I come from a centre that's focused on higher education, teaching and learning a lot of the time. We think it's important. Obviously, most institutions do. But once again, it's the question of how this is structured, how consistent it is across institutions, and the extent to which we have norms, both in Australia and also internationally. A lot of it hasn't really been required until recently. If you go back to 1985, some of the historical work we've done much earlier, this sort of stuff is partly anathema. The assumption was these people are the experts, so therefore how could you possibly have continuing professional development in key areas? Okay, so this brings us to, and I'll start to move a bit faster now. So are credentials required to recognise and reward teaching quality, to the sort of meat of it? Thought about academia as a profession. We've thought about some of the changes in who is teaching. So this allows us to start to think about whether something like credentialing teaching is actually practical and desirable. So it's been done elsewhere, all right? This is the first thing to say. So people might be familiar, but in the Netherlands now, the University Teaching Qualification, and I will not try and pronounce it. I don't know, somebody here might be able to, but the BKO is, it was originally just started as a couple of universities. I think it was the University of 20 and a few others got together. It is now, although it's not mandated, it is the absolute default that is required. So all of the institutions, or 14 big ones in the Netherlands, now require this of anybody that's teaching. Okay, so it is possible, but, and this is where it starts to get complicated when we unpick it, they have a much smaller and in some ways coherent system, because this is only required of certain staff. It's mutually recognised. It is, as I say, it's in effect now mandatory. But mandating a similar sort of qualification in Australia really does start to raise a whole lot of these issues I alluded to before. If it's a requirement of being employed in particular roles, so we're required by the regulator, there's firstly a whole lot of equity issues that might start to be raised about who has the capacity to go and get a qualification prior to applying for a job. If we're asking people to do a 1 or 2 year teaching credential, right, prior to getting an academic job, instantly people will point out that academic jobs, unlike things like the teaching workforce, are often a lot harder to get and a lot less stable. You know, once again, back to the question of who's doing the teaching. Is it even reasonable to ask somebody who's going to step into a tutorial role or even a level A role where they might have a 2 or 3 year contract to ask them to do a 2 or 3 year teaching qualification? As I mentioned, the enterprise agreements and the IR arrangements. I mean, the process of requiring all your teaching staff in your institutions to have a teaching qualification, even the transition to that within some of the EA arrangements, I think would be an extremely complicated conversation. And we might find that the union and others have strong views around who can be required to do what, which of course raises the question of who is providing the training. And if we're providing training and institutions, practically the cost of even somebody like the University of Melbourne, the cost of us providing a 1 year graduate certificate in university teaching is obviously significant, right? Now you try and scale that up to, you know, tens of thousands of staff, and you start to get in a situation where how this could work is not necessarily straightforward. And I think, you know, just to emphasise some of these points that I've made, I'm just going to show you a little bit of data about how people are moving in various ways. So if we look at, as I said earlier, and showed a lot of people at level A are doing the teaching. If we look at the median length of service for them, and this is data from a number of about 3/4 of the sector, we can see that from this was 2023, 2023 and 2019, that's the black, and the blue, the thing's been cut off, is 2023. You can see that the median length of service for people at level A is, you know, less than 2 years. A lot of those are obviously PhD students, right? But as I'll show you in a moment, we've got, you know, level Bs, 4 years. Now, what does this mean? Well, if I put it here, Some of this is obviously people being promoted and getting other jobs, right? But importantly, I'll just call your attention to the bar graph on the right. I mean, if you can see there, level A, which is just here, you know, a turnover of 30% in a given year is pretty significant. And the reality is, a lot of people that are completing PhDs and undertaking some short-term contracts are leaving the sector. Right? And that really does start to raise questions about what you could possibly, in fairness, require these people to do in terms of having a teaching qualification before they step in the classroom. Which brings us to the other part of it and thinking about, if we're not going to require it, what might we be doing there in terms of thinking about career structures and incentives? Well, as most institutions do now, they offer this to staff as a way to enhance. They don't require it, and I think if we think about the move to have a larger number of staff that are focused on teaching, obviously teaching-focused careers are going to need more reward and recognition structures if we're going to have people promoted up the line and differentiate. People need to be able to demonstrate excellence. And it's often proposed that having these kind of qualifications is one way that teaching staff can demonstrate that they're doing good teaching. Now, this is a very different way to consider the question of credentialing as a minimum requirement to ensure quality that's happening in the classroom. But nonetheless, it is proven popular. In fact, this is the default at a whole lot of institutions in terms of what we're doing with this. We have opportunities like advanced HE, and I think most institutions now are signed up to advanced HE fellowships and have a large proportion of their staff. So this is one way that obviously institutions are trying to broadly recognise and increase the quality of teaching within their institutions. Okay? So the flips, you know, this is the carrot rather than the stick. So, whoops, I'm going to skip that one. Before I wrap up and talk a little bit about where I think this might go, I just want to say, so we've got the incentives, we've got the requirements, just want to say a little bit about how the teaching and academic workforce has changed quite a bit, because it is sort of, I think, the last piece when we want to start to think about this puzzle of how we might do it or how we might require it. So the first thing is, just grab my note out here, to look at some of the changing demographics in the sector. Now, it's a bit hard to see here, but the darker bars, right, it's an age distribution for academic staff in 1989. You know, it's broadly a nice little bell curve, and as you'll see, it's got a low number at the above 59, that's what that group is. Now these bars here is the age profile from a few years ago. What's the obvious difference? We have a whole lot of people that are over 59 in academic ranks. Now I'll show in a moment who some of those people are, but of course the message here is that we are really moving through a time where we're going to have a whole lot of academics retire across the sector, right? We said this 10 years ago, people worked longer. It is going to happen now. Now, who are these people? This is just the age profile divided into male and female. I've just used two genders because that is the way the data was reported. You'll see that here, this is over 59 male, right? So broadly, I'll just put it up here. Well, what we end up with is there is a lot of senior men in the system, right? If I'm blunt, you know, pale, male and stale. Yes, it's a bit derogatory, but unfortunately that is, you know, a accurate description of some people. That group is moving through, okay? We are at the point where we are having full demographic change within the sector. It is becoming, and you know, there's still a lot of structural barriers, but we will see a much more even gender mix. Now, I raise this partly just to point out that we are really in a time now where in the last, you know, several decades, we've moved through a whole cohort of academics who are trained and worked in a very different world. That is long gone, right? And we've got an opportunity now to think about how we set it up for a academic workforce that is, the genders, obviously that's one thing, but in terms of what people are doing, how we're structuring academic careers, right? Now is the moment. So, where does this leave us in terms of the question of should we credential for all academic, or should we require all academic staff to have credentials? So, I think most people that have looked at this in different ways tend to land on what I think is in some ways unsurprising, but also probably requires some careful thought by governments and others, is that we probably want any teaching and credential requirements to match the teaching activity that we're undertaking there. And what do I mean by this? Well, this kind of brings it all together when we think about it. Just going to return to 1985. As I mentioned, a number of those categories there were about what the work did. We had audio-visual people. Now, predominantly, having looked into this with our own centre, some of those people were effectively learning designers by a different name, right? Obviously, we've got a whole spectrum of people now that are contributing to education. So a potentially more sensible way to start to think about this question of requiring credentials is not to go down the route that's used in the Netherlands. It's starting to say that if people are undertaking particular teaching activities, they should have training opportunities and in some cases requirements that match that, right? Which provides us with a much broader spectrum of how we do this within institutions, right? It is less rigid and it's less about regulation. So we end up in a situation, that's some data that Liz showed yesterday, so I won't. We end up in a situation where having a uniform rule isn't probably that useful, right? And putting it in the teaching standards. But what we can do is just make sure that we mix mechanisms for recognition and incentives to think about career structures, and we also ask universities to provide training that's appropriate to the educational activity, which, surprisingly enough, is of course a lot of what is going on at the moment in most institutions, and is that evolving conversation. So, if we are worried about questions of teaching quality, and if governments are and regulators are worried about questions of teaching quality, it's also probably helpful for them and us to reflect on the question of how we celebrate and support all different forms of teaching, and maybe that is enough of an incentive to start to shift this, rather than thinking things like mandating credentials is going to absolutely solve the problem. It might get a headline, but I suspect that it's going to create the kind of challenges that are hard to untie and partly get us into the sort of legitimacy crisis that a lot of institutions are in today. Now, I haven't said anything about AI, and I've talked very little about the question of teaching and learning and subtle and what's going on in the classroom or the lab. And I've done that deliberately in going through some of this material because I think that in some ways there's a lot of evidence that answers those kind of questions. We know that having people that are better trained and better qualified tend to get better outcomes in the classroom. But obviously it's not that simple. There's a range of inputs, and if we don't fully recognise the complexity there, especially when it comes to what governments do or indeed what we mandate within our institutions, then we're just going to end up having these same conversations again and again. And I might leave it there. Thanks very much.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Will. That's so much data. Now, I'd love to ask you a question about each slide, to be really honest, but you started off with that we have a teaching anxiety, and you finished talking about we might get a headline from mandating credentials, but it's not going to solve the problem, essentially.
Yep, absolutely.
I just wanted to talk a little bit more about that, because you've given a really compelling argument for why that's the case. But given what we've seen with regulation, are you concerned that we might end up with a mandated solution sooner than we think?
And I think it's a really good question. And this is where it's hard to untie debates around whether we want a teaching credential from broader debates around the legitimacy of a lot of what's going on in universities. And I guess that's, for me, one of the key concerns here. I mean, it might get a good headline because it seems like it's something that's a hard and fast rule to solve the problem. But as we've seen in a whole lot of areas, that is something that the government is quite interested in doing, right, is getting the headline to seem like they've solved the problem. Part of this is honestly back on us, I think. You know, worrying too much about whether something's mandated, probably that anxiety is coming because, you know, frankly, although many people would argue that, you know, the quality of teaching within the universities is significantly better than it was in 1985, okay? 1970s, 60s. There's obviously still a lot of work to do there in terms of what we're thinking. So this is on us to partly tell that story about how that's changed, but also to make sure that we're really comfortable that we've got robust systems in place to demonstrate that we're assuring it. Sorry, it's a bit of a rambly answer.
No, that's a very good answer. The demographic cliff. We've talked about it for 10 years, as you say. How do you know it's really going to disappear now? Where are they all going?
Well,
so this is
no.
Yeah.
No, I'm choosing my words carefully here. No, I mean, it's a fair question, and I think, you know, if you broadly look across a whole lot of professions, and I did talk a bit about how we aren't a profession, you know, people are in employment longer at the moment. We did have a moment in post-war period where there was a lot of earlier retirements. So in some ways, maybe this is actually just a reversion to type. Of course, you know, naturally people, you know, do step away. I think we should be really conscious that there are institutions around the world, and can you guess which two, some people might know in the room, which require people to retire at 65 if you're an academic professor?
Oxford?
Yes, Oxbridge, it is. So if you're at Oxford, and they did try to overturn this a couple of years ago, but you're still you can still keep the title, still keep the email address, as friends of mine continue to use, but you know, unless you've got some external funding, you are required to step back from those kind of duties. And you know, why is this the case? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons, especially if you're at Oxford, you know, very attractive to hang around, especially given the amount of latitude that staff have there. But it is also about thinking about how workforces are being replaced and trained and making sure we've got opportunity for people. We also, you know, clearly don't want all our teaching staff to be, you know, we want them all ages, we want a variety of diversity, and that gets very hard when there's a very strong incentive to keep people there. Now, in Australia, the demographic cliff, I suspect, is naturally happening. Okay, we will see a whole lot of people move out, but equally, I think the other thing we need to be very conscious of is that the reason we've got this is such a cliff is because we massively expanded higher education during the period just after this. So we actually brought a whole lot of people into it. We're probably cresting, I think many people would argue, in terms of the scale and size. It's hard for us in the universities and indeed other higher education providers to fully get our heads around, but we may be in a period of decades where we're not growing, right? And that's not really something the sector's done.
Don't tell Mr. Clare.
Yeah, well, don't. Yeah. Well, you'll notice they quietly dropped to the 55% aspiration to have people with bachelor degrees by 2050, and they've now just focused on the broader tertiary 80% target. I think we should just watch that carefully. So, yes, there's partly opportunity of a demographic cliff coming, but it's not going to be that simple.
Do we have questions from the audience?
That was very athletic. So Ivan Costantino, I lead the recruitment team at the University of Sydney.
Yep.
I just had a comment first on mandating teaching credentials or qualifications and the challenge that would pose in terms of international recruitment. So how do you standardize when you have international candidates that you want to attract into Australia, for instance? And the other question was really around, does the credentialing really need to take 1 to 2 years, and can it be built into your PhD as part of, is it more of a graduate school question? So.
No, and I think, obviously I packed a lot of content in there, but there are two really critical issues that I was going to touch on in an earlier version of this presentation. Now, in terms of the international credentialing, you're absolutely right? That's yet another reason that makes it very difficult to mandate, especially when people are coming into employment, as you say, with recruitment. But it also, and I think this is part of the reason I tried to tell a big story, it does start to highlight how much of what we do, is based on individual practice at universities and assumed norms that have a basis in other international systems, right? We're following the leaders, and rankings, for better or worse, are tied to some of the more prominent institutions. Are we really going to, refuse a senior professor from somewhere like Stanford because they don't have a teaching qualification? Obviously, even me saying it sounds silly, right? Which really illustrates the point that you made. And down to the 1 to 2 year, could it be built in? And maybe I didn't emphasise this enough in the presentation, but it does really it forces us to ask that sharp question. Do we want people trained, maybe credentialed in a particular way before they walk into the classroom, right? Or is this something that can be built over time? Now, my answer, and I think a lot of my colleagues come to the view that expecting people to be credentialed when they walk into the classroom is both impractical and probably not necessary, but, and there's a big but here, it's about thinking through, what's a reasonable amount of time to get people qualified, but also how we're ensuring that they have the basics. So, for example, that's why I ended on the, matching the teaching opportunities and requirements to the teaching activity and task. For tutors, we might just need something very short. If you're course coordinating, a number of us would argue you probably need to have something more substantive if we're going to ensure quality and have consistency across what we're teaching. And obviously it varies by discipline, but having been intimately involved in some of this for quite a while, I can say that there's also a lot that doesn't vary by discipline when it comes to thinking about how we're structuring good pedagogy, right? How we're working with students, how we're ensuring it's a quality educational experience. There you go, there's my rant.
Thanks. That was a really interesting talk. I'm really glad I was here for that. Just a comment, in my school at the University of Melbourne, we have about 100 FTE academics. We used to have 70 to 80 casual tutors per semester. Now we have 1 to 3 because we hired over a period of time, since before COVID actually, all of them and others variously as ongoing level A staff. We only have about 2 left now at level A. These are education-focused staff. So the reason I'm saying this is because all of them have different credentials to teach. And some of them perhaps were language teachers at a high school. Some of them maybe did teaching as part of their PhD. There's so many different ways people have can demonstrate their ability to teach, right? Is there a way that we could think about using that in terms of how we look at students' work as an equivalent and credit it to their degree or something like that? So a body which would look at academic credentials for teaching and can verify that whatever the experience they have is credited towards that, rather than having, for all the reasons you've said, it's quite impractical to have a system like, say, for teachers, you've got your VIT, you've got, they have to do the ongoing professional development. But yeah, look at what have they actually done in their career and how can we credit that towards some kind of micro-credential.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question, and it goes to the previous question as well around could some of this, be incorporated into doctoral training, right? I think the answer is that absolutely. If institutions start to think about what's an efficient way to recognise qualifications or experiences or skills with their staff, that is I suspect much more practical than trying to have a uniform system. But of course that in itself requires some careful thinking about what we recognise, how we recognise it, how it varies by discipline. And it may be that it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be an or, it might be an and we may end up with a situation where we've got a whole suite of different things, and then it becomes the job of academic boards and others to really keep an eye on some of this. But I also don't think it's impossible.
Thanks. Fantastic presentation. My name's Jesse. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne.
Hi, Jesse. How are you?
We do know each other. So, sort of building on that, the question of do we embed these kinds of, trainings inside of the PhD? Is there actually, from my view, there's kind of already a mechanism that we could tap into, which is that students with an RTP, even off-fee offset, can access, I think it's 4 free units. The government will pay for 4 free units of coursework throughout your candidature. So is there a way to utilise the fact that government's already paying for it and accredit and have an embedded grad cert that students that actually want to do teaching can do throughout their PhD that actually gets accredited? Because when I looked into accessing the 4 free units, I was told you can't get any certification out of this. It's just for your pure enjoyment of doing additional courses, additional units for free. And I know a lot of students, when I talk to them about it, they sort of don't see the point of using these courses because it's just additional work on top of your PhD that you're not getting any recognition for. So maybe, is there a way that we can reform how those units are utilised so that way students that actually do want to go down the teaching pathway can kind of access it, and it doesn't cost the university. The university still is getting paid to run it through the government, and will kind of be more efficient?
I think it's a really good question in terms of what mechanisms are there. Now with RTP, obviously a lot of doctoral students aren't on RTP, so universities will say, well, we're not funded for that, we're funding doctoral training elsewhere. But it is a good question around what could be required of doctoral training. Now, if there's one area, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, if there's one area government might strongly encourage universities to have requirements in doctoral training, it would be for some sort of teaching credential. Even for those that don't intend to teach, I think it's probably a valuable activity. If you look at the structure of something like a doctorate in most of the big US institutions, there's a reason that part of the deal, as it were, to do a doctorate is that you're a teaching assistant. That's not just a way for you to pay your way, it's also a really important training process, right, where you're working with somebody to learn teaching skills. It is embedded in the system, it's the way they put federal money into it. I could talk about this for a long time and I won't bore you, but so absolutely, and I think that's one of the areas we might look at it. Of course, that does run up against the really other fundamental question with all of this, which is that these are self-accrediting institutions in the main if they're offering doctorate, well, they are if they're offering doctorates, right? So what can actually be imposed in terms of content, right? And that is one of those conversations that gets dismissed until somebody says something and then everybody goes to the barricades. And I'm going to say this because I've watched it time and time again in various different ways. But yeah, it's a great question.
Hi, Gwil. Jackson Harnwell from University of Melbourne. I think you've made the case really compellingly that kind of entry qualification is very difficult. Yeah. And I'm also not sure that it solves the problem of sustained quality in teaching. The needs of educators are changing rapidly. People are in these careers for a long time. So I'm more interested in the continuing professional development aspect and sort of maintaining a license to teach, if you like. My question is, how do you do that in a way that can be kind of consistently recorded, and recognised? And how do you prevent it from being a way for academics who are less interested in teaching to let their licence lapse and then have more time for research?
Yet again, another fantastic question. I mean, many institutions here will have peer review of teaching. We do at Melbourne. You may be, familiar with those sort of opportunities. I think the CPD is, in some ways, the harder part, and it can't be just down to requiring people to do a refresher course. I mean, there's a reason I mentioned, professional accreditation. If there's particular knowledges we require or skills we require, because it's a risk-based often question, we don't want people to be doing things that hurt people or break the law. It's obviously a lot fuzzier in some ways in terms of teaching quality and professional development. So there we do need to look to other mechanisms, I think.